Hi, this is a project for beginner painters and it is exploring complementary colours. The complementary colours mostly used here are blue and orange, and it's also looking at negative painting, the skill of painting the background, the negative space, which in this case will be around the two koi fish in the painting. Right now you can see I am taping down my piece of paper. It's 90-pound Arches cold press paper. I usually use 140 pounds, but for demonstration purposes, to save a little bit of money, I use 90 pounds. So for this project I'm using a 3/8 inch border. That helps keep the paper nice and flat. The tape does have the tendency to lift up from the paper, so I like to make sure there's enough paper held down firmly, and you need to really push that tape down. So the first step that I will be doing, now the paper is securely fastened to the board, is to wet the paper all over, because I'm going to do a wet in wet background of the yellow and the orange and some red that will become the fish when we do the negative painting. So I've wet my paper. I'm lifting it to make sure that I can see it's wet and shiny all over, not dripping. And I'm using here some Winsor yellow. Now you can use azo yellow, which is an aureolin, or you can use cadmium yellow, or you can use a gamboge, a light gamboge. Now I'm using transparent orange, and then I'm going to put a little bit of cadmium orange on. You may not have these colours. You could mix your own orange with cadmium red and cadmium yellow, or any red and yellow together to make a bright orange. Now a little bit of cadmium red, and I'm letting those blend wet in wet and dry completely. Now I've drawn my two koi fish, and I'm wetting my paper so that my paint will flow nicely onto the paper, and I don't want my paint to dry before I'm finished this painting. And remember, I have speeded this video up to 2 times normal painting speed, so you will go a little bit more slowly, which means more carefully. I'm using ultramarine blue mixed with phthalo blue, and sometimes I'll use just ultramarine blue and sometimes just phthalo blue. Phthalo blue is a beautiful colour, but sometimes it can be a little bit intense and overpowering. Now I made a mistake. I meant to keep the little whiskers by the fish's mouth dry and paint around them, and because I'm focused here on videoing, I forgot. I'm not as careful when I'm thinking about the video camera, and I will fix that at the end of the project. But I really must focus on keeping my paint wet, which means you have to mix up a fairly large puddle of nice wet paint and keep dipping into it. Don't paint with a dry brush, or don't paint with such little paint that you can't let it puddle. As I get down to the bottom of the fish here, I'm going to add a little bit of Viridian Green to make it sort of more watery looking, give it just a little accent of a different colour. And because there's red in the background, the Viridian Green will be a complement to that too. It's not the main complement, but it will work. And as I work my way around the fish, I have to be very careful not to get my wrist in the wet paint too. I usually, if I am painting, I will usually turn my board. I didn't want to disturb the camera at this point, but you can turn your board. And again, I go carefully around one whisker, and you'll see in a moment I completely forget about the second one again. And a little bit more Viridian Green there. At the end of the painting, when it's all dry, I use some Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white to paint those whiskers back in again. I found that this is a really helpful addition to my watercolour tools to fix little mistakes like that, or to do a little white accent at the end of the painting when it's all dry. And the tails of the fish, I like those to go off the edge. It connects the subject matter to the border of the paper and makes just for a little bit more of an interesting composition. Make sure eye come in from one side, wind its way around the paper and sort of go off the other side, but then come back in again. Every time you see my brush go off to the side, I'm dipping in more paint, making sure my paint's nice and wet, That way I don't get any streaks or back runs or little things happening that you regret when the paint dries and it doesn't look very nice. Now you can leave it just like this for your background. I decided to get a little bit of salt while the paint is still wet. The paint has to be wet for this to work. I'm sprinkling a little bit of table salt on there, and that will form white texture like little bubbles in the water. I just think it looks nice in a background like this. Gives it a little bit of interest and texture. I'm making sure it's really dry.